Is the Bible reliable? Is there evidence for the Bible? What is evidence? Let's get into it. It's tough to go through a lot of information quickly, but I have to build your faith so that we can proceed with further teachings. I want to show you why you can trust the Bible and then talk to you from a place of authority about what the Bible says. Um, so this is probably going to be, two separate 1 hour videos. I honestly believe you could spend your whole life studying the truth about God and never really get to the end. And I think that's part of the splendor of it all. It's really when we stop studying, stop learning, and stop seeking that our faith or our belief begins to fade. Um, let's hop into a couple objections that others have held and many still hold. This was a quote from Richard Dawkins in regard to how many atheists felt about religion up to and then after 9/11. Many of us saw religion as harmless nonsense. Beliefs might lack all supporting evidence, but, we thought, if people need a crutch for their consolation, where's the harm? September 11th changed all that. If it gives you comfort, great. I mean, after all, if you want to believe in things that have no supporting evidence, I don't care, basically, is what he's saying. But then he goes on to say 9/11 changes that because now we see that, you crazy people, you crazy nuts are willing to kill yourselves and take all of us with you for these outlandish beliefs. That changes things, okay? Sometimes it's, people will say, why do atheists sound like they're saying there is no God and I hate him? you know? Or they'll say, there is no God and I hate the one that you guys believe in, the one that doesn't exist, the one that you've created, the one that tells you to fly planes into buildings. To many people, religion is dangerous, and they're right. Look at Hamas in Israel right now. This is a religious war. They also believe that if you believe in the God of the Bible, that you hold that belief without any supportive evidence. In fact, some people will say you believe this in spite of the evidence. You believe all kinds of things like talking donkeys and talking snakes and parting seas and walking on water. For the longest time, I didn't understand if there was evidence for the Bible or what the evidence was. Now, of course, another question is, do you think that Dawkins knows what qualifies as evidence to begin with? I don't think you guys thought much about it. I really didn't either. I don't think that you guys have thought about, like, what kind of evidence do we use in the courtroom today in criminal trials to get beyond that crazy proof that we call reasonable doubt. So I'm going to teach you what qualifies as evidence and what they use in the court systems today. We're going to find out if we have any of this kind of evidence for our belief in the Bible. Because Dawkins is wrong. We have all kinds of evidence. He just doesn't understand what counts as evidence. Now, I'm not an expert on this, so I would recommend that you guys get this book, Cold Case Christianity, to go in depth and learn further. Last episode, we talked about kind of truth. We know that truth exists. There is an ultimate and objective truth. We know that God exists, and we know that the Bible is the truth about God. But what is the evidence for that? I want to share with you the nature of cold cases. Cold cases are events in the distant past that are unsolved, okay? We're going to talk about a case here in a few minutes from 1981, 43 years ago. These are events in the distant past. I don't have any living eyewitnesses who can come in today and tell me, hey, I saw it. I saw how it happened, and here's exactly how it happened. If there was that kind of evidence in a cold case, it wouldn't be cold, okay? It would have been solved 43 years ago. It's unsolved because there was no witness on that particular case that we're going to talk about. This guy stated he never had a case with the benefit of forensic evidence, because if you have forensic evidence cases, like DNA cases, those cases get solved quicker. DNA evidence is not the nature of most cold cases. They're cold because of this. So we have to make them a different way, okay? He makes them using cumulative circumstantial pieces of evidence. And I bet when I say that word circumstantial, many of you, like me, think, well, that's junk. Because the culture has convinced us that circumstantial evidence is bad. How many times have you heard that, during these past few election cycles? There's just circumstantial evidence what this guy did and circumstantial evidence what that guy did, and they kind of downplay it. It's just a circumstantial evidence case. Why do you think they're inclined to put the word just in front of circumstantial? Because you don't think circumstantial evidence counts, okay? Or a lot of people, they try to tell you circumstantial evidence doesn't count. Really? All of his cases are 100% purely circumstantial cases, and he's never lost. Circumstantial evidence is the nature of cold cases, and it's very powerful. I'll show you that here in a minute. It's also the nature, though, for the case for the Bible. We're studying an event that occurred in the distant past, for which we have no living eyewitnesses to come in today and tell us what happened. And we have no forensic evidence or DNA evidence or fingerprints, okay? We have to decide what really happened 2,000 years ago using the exact same skill set used to solve what happened 43 years ago. It applies. And we don't care about possible, okay? Let's make that very clear. Anything and everything is possible. It's possible we're not even here right now. It's possible we were abducted last night and we're in an alien simulation and, we're all having this group dream. That is possible. However, it's not reasonable, okay? Reasonable is what matters to us, okay? They don't care what's possible. Anything and everything is possible. But not everything is reasonable, and that's why that's the judicial standard. If the legal standard was beyond any possible doubt, we could never convict anybody, because there's always some possible doubt. There's nothing that you know today that you believe in that is no scientific fact that isn't open to at least possible doubt. This is why reasonable doubt is the judicial standard. Now, how do you decide if something is reasonable? Well, let's work a case together. A case in which this young man has been accused of killing his girlfriend with this baseball bat. He's bludgeoned her to death. Now, the question is, how do we solve it? Well, we can use two kinds of evidence, because there are only two kinds of evidence. There is direct evidence and there is indirect evidence. Those are the only two forms. Indirect evidence is also called circumstantial. Direct evidence only involves one type of evidence: eyewitness testimony. Nothing else qualifies as direct evidence. Everything else, DNA, indirect, circumstantial. Really? Yep. Fingerprints, circumstantial. Really? Yep. Unless you have an eyewitness, you do not have a direct evidence case. You have a circumstantial case. So let's make this case in two ways. First, let's make it directly, okay? We need an eyewitness, so we're going to put in an eyewitness, okay? We need somebody who can tell us what happened the day of the murder. Well, the suspect, why don't we just go and ask him? He was there. Do you think if we went and asked the suspect, we would get an honest statement from him? Probably not. I need a different eyewitness, somebody other than the suspect who can say something like this: I saw what happened. I was across the street. I live in this neighborhood, and my neighbor, she's a lovely young girl. She's always fighting with her boyfriend. The last fight was bad, and I could hear it. I look up, and There through the window, I see he's punching her, and she goes down. Then he goes over and he gets a baseball bat and starts wailing on her. It's a mess. There's blood everywhere. He ran out to his car and he drove off. As an investigator, you'd be like, "You saw that?" "Yeah, oh yeah, I saw it." "Well, how do you know for sure who it was?" "Well, I know that kid." "Okay, well, how do you know that kid?" "I know everyone in this neighborhood. We are a tight neighborhood. Everyone here has grown up together. We've done block parties together. We've done holidays together. We've done Thanksgiving and Christmases together. As a matter of fact, the guy was wearing the sweater I got for him 2 years ago." Wow. That is what you call a good witness. If that witness can survive under cross-examination, we're going to make this entire case based off of one piece of evidence, a direct piece of evidence, the eyewitness testimony of this neighbor. If we did that, that would be a direct evidence case. Okay, I hope we're clear on that. Now let's change the scenario slightly. What if our killer, unfortunately, on the day of the murder was not looking like this? He wasn't even wearing the shirt that he got for Christmas. Let's say on the day of the murder, he actually had a mask covering his head. Now, unfortunately, our witness can't identify him directly. She can say, "Well, he's about the right size and shape as the boyfriend, even sounded like him, but I can't tell you for sure if it was a boyfriend because, let's face it, he had a mask on his head." Now, do you think that that witness testimony is going to be enough to get the guy convicted? Probably not. So we got to make the case a different way. We can't make it a direct evidence case, okay? Not anymore. No eyewitness. So how do you do that? Well, we go and talk to the suspect. We knock on his door and ask him, "What were you doing on the day of the murder?" Yeah, I was with my buddies." "Okay, what are their names?" Guy gives us 2 names of his friends. We go and interview his friends, and they say, "I don't know what he's talking about. Haven't seen the guy in weeks." So he's lying about his alibi. He fits the general description, and he's lying about his alibi. How many of you would convict him now, just off that? So you take that, you get a search warrant, and at his house you find what could be the murder weapon. He owns a baseball bat. Not just any kind of baseball bat. The baseball bat, you notice on the thick part of the bat, it's all dinged up and nicked up like he's been using it as a club, not as a bat for balls. And when we test it to see if there's any biological material on the bat, like blood or tissue, we discover it's clean because it's been soaked in bleach. He has bleached his baseball bat. Now, can you think of why anyone would bleach their baseball bat? No alibi, fits the general description, bleached, dinged up, possible murder weapon. How many of you would convict him now? So the search warrant also reveals a pair of jeans. And on the jeans, we use luminol, which is a chemical that luminesces under certain types of body fluid, including blood, saliva, etc. Also, certain kinds of detergent will luminesce. And these jeans are luminescing at the knees. So we do a search for biological material, but it's negative. There's no blood because whatever it is, he's cleaned it. It appears to be luminescing because of detergent, and that happens sometimes. So apparently he's successfully spot cleaned the pants to get something off of the knees. Now those pants are covered in dirt and mud everywhere except the knees. So it's not dirt or mud he was interested in, otherwise he would have cleaned the entire pair of pants. Our suspect was interested in something other than dirt or mud that was at the knees of his pants. Why was he trying to spot clean his pants? Bleached baseball bat, lying alibi, spot clean pants, fits the general description. Also no signs of forced entry into the house. Whoever did this murder, they got into the house without having to kick in the door or break a window. So they either had a key or the victim just allowed them to come in freely. And of course, if this was the boyfriend, the victim probably would have allowed him to come in. You also find out through your investigation there were only 3 people who had a key. The victim had a key, the victim's mother who passed about 2 months earlier had a key, and the crazy boyfriend had a key. Okay, so then you go and you interview him, and he tells you this. "Yeah, I have an up and down relationship with her. I love her, but I lose my temper. She knows that about me. She knows I can't control it. I wish I could. Yeah, I've smacked her before, but I always apologize. I always feel bad about it. And, after I apologize, she takes me back, and I wish it was different. And then he says, yeah, on the day of the murder, I got upset because I found out she was cheating on me. Who would cheat on this guy, right? He even admits that he threatened to kill her in front of her friends. He says, I was angry when I said that, but, I didn't kill her. I would never do that. How many of you think he's our guy? The witness says, when he ran out of the house, he had an unusual boot that had a leather band on the side of the boot running vertical. And so you do some research, and you find out that only one manufacturer even makes a boot like that. It's not a popular boot. It doesn't sell very well, and there's even only one store that sells the boot in the whole county. And that store has only sold like 30 pairs in the past 2 years. Who do you think owns a pair? Our suspect. They're in his closet. You see, it's kind of like a statistical issue now. He's got a 1 in 3 relationship to the key. He's got a 1 in 30 relationship to the boot. So how many of those 1 in 30 people with the boot also have a key? Okay, you see what begins to happen here. And if you had gotten to his house just a little bit earlier, he'd have been dead because he was getting ready to commit suicide. You know that because on the counter next to where you put the search warrant, you discover a half-written suicide note. And on that note, he says that on the day of the murder, he lost his temper and he did something he wishes he could take back. He exploded. He can't live with himself now. His whole life has changed. It's ruined. He's ruined it for everybody. He can't go forward, so he has to kill himself. But he didn't finish the letter because you got there a little bit too soon, and you don't even know what it is he's talking about exactly because he doesn't say he killed his girlfriend. One last piece of evidence. When the witness sees him drive away, he gets in an unusual car. She happens to know from her past experience that it was a mustard-colored 1972-ish Volkswagen Karmann Ghia. On your search warrant, there's no car in the garage. But you look in the state registry, and in the entire state, there's only 3 operational 72 Volkswagen Karmann Ghias, and 1 is registered to our suspect. And it's the right color. You end up finding later that he ditched it. Now, you could obviously argue that it's possible that he's not our killer. But that's not what we're looking at. We're looking at reasonable. Now, if we're going to do this in front of a jury, we don't do this with just 8 pieces of evidence. We would do this with 80 pieces of evidence. This is called death by 1,000 paper cuts. Because the more you have, the more compelling the circumstantial evidence case is. It's a cumulative circumstantial evidence case. And he does this all the time. He does this all the time, and it turns out the most reasonable inference is this guy unifies all the evidence. He's the one explanation that we need to unify all this evidence. Does that make sense? Him alone gets it done. A defense attorney could say something like, well, I can explain the key away, or, maybe the pants, I can explain why they're spot cleaned, or I can explain why, he has a bleached, dinged up bat. He can explain certain things in different ways. But how do you explain away 80 incredibly unreasonable coincidences that happen to occur on the same day to make it look like the guy's guilty, right? What is more reasonable? That these are all just crazy circumstances, or he's just guilty? Okay, the book makes a point of showing you how this is the notion of death by 1,000 paper cuts, and they do this all the time in criminal trials. Judges understand this, and judges instruct juries that circumstantial evidence is to be given the exact same weight as direct evidence. Did you know that? That's why prosecutors love circumstantial evidence cases. There's 2 reasons. Number 1, judges instruct jurors with this language. Both direct and circumstantial evidence are acceptable types of evidence, and neither is entitled to any greater weight than the other. And 2, witnesses lie all the time. Remember, witnesses are the only ones who can provide direct evidence. Witnesses lie. They just do, They want to help out their cousin who's convicted of murder, or they want to be on TV, or whatever the case may be. So you have to vet through these people. And I'm going to tell you some things that I've learned in investigations I've been a part of. Never trust an eyewitness. Never. You will get burned. Okay, he talks about this in the book. You don't trust eyewitness testimony. So if a skeptic says to you, I can't trust the eyewitnesses in the Bible, I'm with you. Okay? You don't trust eyewitnesses. You test eyewitnesses. Now, if they pass the test, you are instructed to trust them by the judge. But they got to pass the test, okay? So if you have a skepticism about eyewitness testimony, I'm okay with that, okay? I want you to test your eyewitnesses. When Mr. Wallace first looked at the Gospels, he thought to himself, look, I know what the test is that we give eyewitnesses, because it's described in the jury instructions and he does it all the time. There's 13 questions that we allow jurors to think about. They're in the book. They're supposed to think about these before they can determine if a witness is reliable. But it basically comes down to 4 areas. To make it easy for you guys, I'm going to put it in these 4 simple sentences. All right? Here they are. Number 1. If a witness was actually there to see what he said he saw. Number 2. Can he be verified or corroborated? Number 3. Has he been honest and accurate, or has he changed his story over time? And then number 4, do they possess a bias? If they pass the test in these 4 areas, you are instructed to trust the witness. You can't be like, oh, I don't like him. Why? Oh, he's got beady eyes or a creepy smile, or he reminds me of someone that I don't like. Okay, well, does he pass the test? Yeah, if he passes the test, then you got to get over it. You can't kick out a witness testimony. You can't just kick it out of trial because you don't like the way someone looks. Okay, it doesn't work that way. You have to have a logical and better reason for that. So, we want to be able to test witnesses in these 4 categories. If they pass the test, you're instructed to trust them. Wallace says, look, he said, it's very interesting. If I'm going to trust the gospel, what the gospels tell me about Jesus, it better be able to pass the test, because that's how we test any witness when we come across them in court. Now, think about this. We have cases today where a supplemental report was written by a detective 43 years ago, recording the events and the statements and activities of eyewitnesses back then. Unfortunately, the eyewitnesses that he's talking about are now dead, and unfortunately, the detective now has Alzheimer's. So we have no access to the author of the report and no access to the witnesses he's writing about. What does that sound like to you? Those are the Gospels. Whatever approach we're going to use to take with the supplemental report, we can take with the Gospel authors. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. And that's why I've learned to trust the Gospel authors as eyewitnesses. He's tested them the same way he tests witnesses in court. I'm not going to go through all of it with you, but I'll do some of it with you, okay? The first objection. Were they actually present to see this happen? There was a case in Los Angeles from 1974 where detectives arrested a man accused of killing a 10-year-old girl, and he confessed to this. This guy confessed to the entire murder, every gruesome detail, everything he did to her, how he got rid of her, what he did with the body, and none of it was true. None of it. Okay? He was actually excluded from the case on the eve of the trial with blood evidence, and back then it wasn't great, but it was enough to exclude him. He's not our killer. Now, the guy clearly has some problems, but he's not the killer, and he's been dead about 16 years now. He's not the killer, and that case is still unsolved. You can't be the killer if you weren't there. He wasn't there. You can't be an eyewitness if you weren't there either. Okay, makes sense? The Bible that we have today was assembled, if you will. The Bible is a library of books assembled over thousands of years. The Bible that we have today was put together 330 years after the actual events in what is called the Council of Laodicea. If the events in the Bible are recorded in a period of time that is much later than when they actually happened, you can't be an eyewitness, okay? So as a skeptic, it was difficult for me to believe that these were written early by eyewitnesses, okay? I believed they were written later on in history, maybe the Council of Laodicea or maybe whenever, but not when they actually took place. After all, if you write about someone after everyone who knew him is dead or out of the region somewhere in a completely different state or country, it's much easier to lie, okay? Because there's no one alive who could tell you you're a liar. If you're going to lie about Jesus, for example, you have to do it either out of the region or much later on in history, okay? And I'm not the only one who feels this way, by the way. There are lots of skeptics who have written lots of books. Probably most famously is this gentleman, Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman has probably written more books about Jesus than about anybody else I can think of. He's a graduate from the Moody Bible Institute, Wheat College. He studied underneath Bruce Metzger, the famed Bible scholar at Princeton. He's written all of these books, and he's an atheist. Interestingly, this gentleman is the head of the Bible department at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He's teaching students about the Bible every day. And he's written lots of books that either claim that all of this stuff has been distorted, corrupted, or was written by frauds and forgers. And Jesus wasn't God. He became God over the years because the story was distorted. Okay, he was a different Jesus before the Gospels were written because they were written much later. If people like Bart Ehrman are right, then we should stop calling the Gospels any form of eyewitness testimony or real history. Okay, it cannot be considered an eyewitness account if it was not written by people who were really there to see it. Now, of course, if we can date it somewhere closer to the life of Jesus, the closer it gets to Jesus, the more reliable it becomes. It could still be a lie, but it's harder to lie late than it is to lie early. Okay, I hope that makes sense. I just need to know where on this timeline do I put these Gospels and on the basis of what evidence? So, Mr. Wallace started to read through the Gospels to collect the evidence that are in the book. The New Testament was written by Luke, in which he records everything that happened in the first century after Jesus ascended into heaven. And that's called the book of Acts. Does Luke ever mention in the book of Acts anywhere the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, which occurs around 70 AD? Does Luke ever mention that? No. Why wouldn't he mention that? You remember in Matthew, Jesus predicts this is going to happen. Wouldn't you want to show people that Jesus is an accurate predictor and actually record that it happened just the way Jesus predicted? But it's missing. Of all the things that happened in history in that area, that was the biggest. Okay, it's like leaving out the Twin Tower attacks in the history of New York. They also came in for years before they destroyed the temple and surrounded the city. They blockaded it and they starved the occupants. That's also missing from the book of Acts. They starved them so desperately that the Jewish historian Josephus says that when they came in and knocked down the walls to finally sack the temple, they discovered one mother who was so desperate her son had died, she was starving so badly, she began eating her son. You don't think they would have mentioned that? That Luke would have recorded that, referred to it, even tangentially at all? Nope, it's missing. Why? At the end of the book of Acts, Paul is still alive in captivity. Now, we know when he died. He was martyred in the same city Luke says he was living in at the time of the book of Acts. Why wouldn't Luke just finish the story? We also know that Peter died around the same time, and that's also missing from the book of Acts. James, the brother of Jesus, is martyred in Jerusalem in 61 AD, and that is missing from the book of Acts. Yet Luke writes about the death of James, the brother of John. That happened in 44 AD. Interesting. Luke mentions James, the brother of John's death, but he leaves out James, the brother of Jesus' death? James, Jesus' brother, was the leader of the largest church on the planet in the city of Jerusalem, the leader of the first church council in Acts 15. Yet you don't mention how he died? Luke has no problem talking about death. I mean, there's 2 or 3 of them recorded in the book of Acts, but you don't mention these? The most important players, the most important people at the time were James, Peter, and Paul, yet you're silent about how they died. Interesting. Why do you think none of this is mentioned in the book of Acts? I think one reasonable inference is that it hasn't happened yet. If it hasn't happened yet, you can't mention it. So let's test that theory. Let's just tentatively date the book of Acts 1 year before the first missing event. Here it is. I could have put this 10 years before, but I'll just put it 1 year before, and that's why it's not mentioned. Now let's test it. Luke wrote 2 books, Acts and Luke. Luke wrote Luke first. So we're going to move over a date for Luke that's going to have to be earlier than the date for Acts, okay? And how do we know that he wrote Luke first? Because he tells us in the first verse of the book of Acts. He says, "In my former book, Theophilus, I wrote about all that Jesus began to do and teach until he was taken up into heaven." So that's the first book, the Gospel of Luke, okay? Acts is everything that happened after that. They used to be together on one scroll or papyrus called Luke Acts. Let's test the theory. Let's go. Paul writes a couple of key letters, and they'll help us test it. They provide more evidence. One of them is called 1 Timothy. 1 Timothy 5, he tells Timothy, "You should take care of your church leaders, like your pastors, your elders, and your deacons, because they do a lot of work for you, and they deserve to be honored, even financially." The interesting thing here is what Paul is using to instruct Timothy. This was written as early as 63 AD. Paul mentions scriptures. He says 2 things. Do not muzzle the ox while it's treading out the grain, and the worker deserves his wages. The first one is from the Old Testament Deuteronomy. The second one is from the New Testament. He's quoting none other than Luke. And he's quoting Luke as early as 63 AD. So we know he's got Luke's gospel as 63, but I'm saying it's as early as 53 because there's another passage that Paul writes to the Corinthian church. This church is a train wreck, okay? They've got people in the church sleeping with their church families, getting drunk at the Lord's Supper. They're a hot mess, okay? Stuff is discussed in the Corinth letters that is not discussed in any other letters. Speaking in tongues? What letters mention that? Corinthian letters, that's it. Okay? The stuff is happening there that's not happening anywhere else. And Paul writes to them and he says, I taught you better. Don't be getting drunk at the Lord's Supper. I taught you how to do the Lord's Supper. And he recites back to them a passage of Scripture to remind them what he had taught them earlier. Now, he had been in Corinth around 51 AD. And he's now writing a few years later, 1 Corinthians, to say, hey, knock it off, I taught you better. And he uses a quote. He says, Jesus said that you should do the Lord's Supper in a particular way. This is my body, which has been given up for you. Do this in remembrance of me. What's he quoting? He's quoting the Gospel of Luke. An even larger section of the Gospel of Luke to the church in Corinth. There's no other version of the Lord's Supper by any other Gospel author in which Jesus says, do this in remembrance of me. It's not in John, it's not in Mark, it's not in Matthew, it's only in Luke, okay? He's quoting Luke here, and he's quoting it saying, I taught you this even earlier. I taught you earlier what Luke said, okay? Go back to what I taught you. So how early is he teaching this? How early is Luke's gospel? I think we're okay saying it's somewhere in AD 50, okay? And here's a little piece that I think is interesting. Investigators do this all the time. They do word studies called forensic statement analysis. I've done this as well. When you do work with bad guys or suspects, you basically tell them, okay, hey, yesterday was the day of the crime. You're a suspect. Do me a favor. On one side of this piece of paper, you have 24 lines. I want you to take a pen. I want you to write everything you did yesterday from the time you got up in the morning to the time you went to bed. You can't erase anything. You can change it with the pen, but you can't erase it and you can't turn the page over. You got 24 lines. Go. Then what we do is we look at this 24-line recital of yesterday's activities and we look for deception indicators. We look for compressions of time, expansions of time, the use of pronouns. We can learn a lot. We can tell you whether he's our guy after we read this 24-line recital. We can also tell you probably what time of day he committed the crime by how the suspect expands and compresses time. Something similar happens in Scripture. Okay, I'm looking at a lot of words that are not necessary because they're words you don't have to use, but you choose to use, and those words give you away. They're almost always adjectives and adverbs. I'll say something like, this is my iPhone. Or I could say, this is my super powerful brand new iPhone 14 Pro Max, latest version, blue iPhone, with a MagSafe case. I added a lot of adjectives to that. Didn't have to, I chose to. If I tell you something about me, why would I say all that? What's the purpose? Luke does the same thing in this passage in Luke 1. He's writing to the person he mentions later, Theophilus. Here's the sentence. Therefore, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, it seemed good to me to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you've been taught. There are 3 additional words you don't need that he chose to use. Here's one. I have carefully investigated this. Not investigated, carefully investigated. You'll read Luke, and Luke's history is pretty meticulous. His account is very careful. Here's another one. Most excellent. Don't need to use that expression. Why is he using it? Well, we think that's because Theophilus may have been a city leader. That is a title that's usually given to leaders in a city. We don't know for sure, okay? But he doesn't have to call them this way. We do know that. As a matter of fact, in the book of Acts, he doesn't use it again. He's already introduced him at the beginning of the text. He doesn't use it again the second time. Just something to think about. Here's another one. An orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus. That word in the Greek means correct chronological order. I'm writing a history of Jesus, an account of Jesus, and I've got it in the right order. Well, isn't history supposed to be in the right order? Why would you need to tell me that your account is in the correct chronological order? Unless, of course, there's another first century account out there that's even earlier than mine, but it's not in the correct chronological order. Well, it turns out there's a bishop named Papias in the first century that says Mark's account is written at the feet of Peter in Rome. And Papias says that Mark's account is correct, but not necessarily orderly. He uses the same Greek word that Luke used. Interesting. So he's got Mark stuff. That's what he says here. But he's not an eyewitness. Luke is not an eyewitness. Luke is actually interviewing the first eyewitnesses, one of which is Mark. And he's asking questions. And now, Luke's got it all in the correct order. And who do you think he quotes more than any other source, word for word? Mark. Probably the first eyewitness. But now he's got Mark's stuff in the right order. Now this makes sense. But that means that Mark's stuff is even earlier. Okay? Now, if I'm wrong by a decade or 2 or 3, that's even too early. That's too early because it's before the events could have taken place. People have a problem with that because they say, how can you remember things 35 years later? You can. It's very easily. We talked about this last time. Remember, impact events. Where were you on 9/11? Those of you who are alive. What were you doing that day? That was 23 years ago. Us who are alive can remember that day like that. Now, what were you doing 23 days ago? Most of you can't remember. There's a big difference in how memories are created. You could go out fishing one day, and one day is just like another. If I ask you what your fishing trip was like 3 years ago, you wouldn't know. But if you're out fishing one day and a dude walks up to you on the water, that's going to be an impact event. You're going to remember that day. Not all fishing days are created equally. Not all memories are created equally. This is done all the time in criminal trials. Defenses try to say disparaging things about memory, but not every memory is created equally, okay? So we use timelines in criminal trials. This is how it looks in the book. Timelines are important. We have to place a suspect near the crime, at the time of the crime, in order to have any chance of convicting him. And it turns out these are written well early enough to have been written by eyewitnesses, at least to have been written by eyewitnesses. Okay, they passed the first test. Doesn't mean they're reliable though. Okay, we have to go a little further. Typically, when we verify things in criminal trials, if somebody says, we're going to look for DNA evidence or physical evidence or maybe, another eyewitness, those are important. Sometimes another eyewitness can tell us something similar that helps us to see if it's true. Do we have anything like that when it comes to the authors of the New Testament? Yes, we do. Corroborative evidence is touchpoint evidence. What does that mean? Well, let's say I don't have videotapes or, digital recordings. I typically, I'll need an eyewitness who can say something that corroborates another witness in some way, okay? Well, we can do this biblically if we just use archaeology. If you've looked at the archaeological support for the New Testament, it's astonishing. There are a bunch of things in the New Testament that people thought were lies as recently as 125 years ago. Here's some of them here. These are things that people thought were lies because they were only mentioned in Scripture, yet we now know that all of these things are true because we've got archaeological support for them. I could do this over and over and over, okay? Now, can I recall and prove every incident in the Bible using archaeology? No. Archaeology is a discipline of fractions, and we've only uncovered a fraction of the sites available. We've only cataloged a fraction of those sites, and we've only dug a fraction of the catalog. And of the ones we've dug, only a fraction are biblical, okay? It's always a discipline of fractions. But I can tell you this, of the 1,000-year history from 600 BC to 400 AD recorded in the Book of Mormon, all the cities, all the people, all the wars, all the artifacts, even the animals described in the Book of Mormon, we have not a single archaeological confirmation for any of it. Not a single inscription with a Mormon name on it, nothing. I don't expect to get everything, but I expect to get something, not nothing. Also, when I was studying cases, I noticed sometimes in witness testimony, you'll get a witness that will give you a statement that seems confusing, like at a bank robbery. Okay, someone might say, this dude walked up to the teller and he just stood there in front of the teller, and then the teller starts giving him money. Well, why did that happen? Oh, I don't know. It was weird. I was behind the guy. He walks up, and I'm not kidding. He looks at the teller. She's got this weird look on her face, and she starts giving him money. Well, that doesn't really make sense. Why in the world would the teller just give him money? So you need another witness. So once you go and you talk to the second witness a couple days later, who was off that day that you were interviewing the first guy, she tells you this. Oh, yeah, I was standing on the other side of the glass with the teller, and this dude walks up, and he has this bulge under his jacket like he's got a gun or something, and he hands a note to the teller. Then the teller reads the note and starts giving him money. Okay, now this makes sense because the second witness has inserted something that makes sense of an otherwise confusing statement. This is called unintentional eyewitness support. This happens all the time in investigative casework. That's why we call both of these people in trial. And as I was reading scripture and studying, I saw tons of examples of this that are always seen in reliable eyewitness accounts. Here, for example, Matthew says when he was standing in front of Caiaphas, Jesus is brought in front of Caiaphas. They spat in his face. They beat him with their fists. They're mocking him. And then they tell Jesus, you're the Christ. Prophesy for us who hit you. How hard would that be? You just hit me. You're standing right in front of me. If you just had one gospel, one witness, Matthew, this makes no sense at all. They walk him in, they They slap him around and they challenge him to tell them who just hit him. Okay, that makes no sense. Unless, of course, you have another eyewitness because you're wondering, why would it be hard to describe who just hit you? Luke tells us they had blindfolded him. Okay, now I get it. If all I had was Matthew, this makes no sense. But Matthew and Luke together, now this makes sense. This kind of unintentional eyewitness support is exactly what we expect to see when we have more than one witness recording an event. Here's another one. Jesus comes into Peter's hometown. He's got Peter's mother-in-law in bed sick with a fever, and he waits all day until the evening to do a healing. I'm wondering, if I don't know anything about the culture and all I had was Matthew, I think an honest question would be, why are you waiting so long to do the healing? What are you like, trying to build the drama or get a crowd? What are you doing here? Well, of course, if you have another eyewitness, Mark, he tells us that when they got there, it was the Sabbath. He's waiting until the end of the Sabbath in the evening. Now I understand. But I wouldn't understand it unless I had another eyewitness to tell me. Okay? You always see this type of thing in reliable eyewitness accounts. Here's another one. If all I had was Matthew, this seems odd. Herod is scared. He's stressing about Jesus and he wants some advice. In the past, he would talk to his council. Remember when Jesus was being born, the star was pointing the way and Herod wanted to know what was going on, and he calls in his religious advisors. Now, years later, he's worried about Jesus, and it says he's talking to his servants. Well, that's odd. Why would you be stressing about this with your servants? If all you had was Matthew's account, this seems kind of odd. Shouldn't he be talking to his advisors? But now we get it, because there's another account out there, the Gospel of Luke. Luke says that these are not servants, but they happen to be disciples of Jesus. So that's exactly who you would want to talk to about it. But if you didn't have Luke, Matthew wouldn't make sense. Again, one account supports the other. That's what we want to see, okay? It's unintentional, but it does help you put the story together. Also, what I noticed in this region, over here in Egypt, we have a lot of manuscripts that come out of this region, and they're not in the Bible. Why? We have some that come out of Israel in this area. We have them in our Bible. But some that come out of this area, Egypt, they're not in our Bible. They're called the Gnostic Gospels, and we don't trust what they say about Jesus. Okay, great. Well, why don't you trust them? Well, these two regions where Scripture comes from, for example, if you look at how you confirm them, it's kind of interesting. It turns out they've done a study of all the first names, the proper nouns that are used for ancient Jewish men and women in both regions. If you're writing in the 1st century in the Egyptian area, these are the most popular names for Jewish men. None of those are, except for Joseph, are in our New Testament accounts. But it turns out the most popular names for men in the area of Palestine, ancient Palestine, are these names. These names appear in our Gospels. So at least it appears that the authors know what people are called in the 1st century in the region in which they're writing about. And that's why you don't have any names except the big ones in the Gnostic Gospels, because they don't know what they're calling people over there. Those are false Gospels, the Gnostic Gospels coming out of Egypt. Usually in the Gnostic Gospels, when it comes to cities, they will only mention one, Jerusalem. Why? Because that's all they knew from over there in Egypt. Yet the Gospel authors who are writing in the region early know all the names of all the cities that were in the region early. Why? How do they know them? Because they're living in them. They're writing in the region early. This kind of simple thing confirms something for us, okay? There's another way to go about it. What if I had another eyewitness, an ancient eyewitness that wasn't a Christian? What did the pagans, what did the non-Christians say about Jesus in the years closest to the life of Jesus? I'll continue that in the next episode. See ya!